Hello and welcome to Aviation 101 with Laura. Today we are going to do a topic that some people have requested, and that is about 14 CFR Part 117, flight and duty time. It's not going to be about dispatchers' flight and duty or duty time because dispatchers don't come under Part 117. I have another video that you can check out about that. But this one is focused on flight crew members, aka pilots. And speaking of pilots, I do want to give a quick shout out to listener.io, which is sponsoring this video, and they provide a safe space for counseling that is excellent for pilots because it is confidential, it is online, and if you check out my other videos about pilot medicals, it is not reportable in most cases to the FAA when you do your pilot medical form. So check them out. I have a promo code in the video description and a referral link, so check it out. So let's get into talking about Part 117 and the rules governing what flight crew members are allowed to do and how much rest they need, and from there. I do have to back up really quick before I get into 117 to say that 14 CFR 121-541 also says that when an airline makes a schedule, it cannot just make an unrealistic type of schedule. So when it has a flight that is scheduled for a certain amount of time, it needs to actually be realistically accomplished in that amount of time. Okay, so Part 117, who does it apply to? Well, two really key things to note. It applies to flight crew members. That means not dispatchers, like I said. It also means not flight attendants, okay? Has nothing to do with them. Also has nothing to do with mechanic. Those are all separate duty rules and rest requirements. But what it does apply to is flight crew, so that would be pilots, operating passenger carrying operations under Part 121. So at the time of this recording, Part 117 only applies to passenger carrying operations. That means people operating cargo carriers, they do not have to be in compliance with Part 117. There's a whole nother part of 121 that still exists. You can still look it up, that covers duty and rest rules for those types of operations. So what we start with is a few definitions. I want to start with this. And this says that the certificate holder, that's the airline, can not give the flight crew member a job to do, and also the flight crew member cannot basically accept that job to do for a job that involves flying. Notice flight duty period, okay? And also you can't continue flying in your flight duty period if that flight crew member reports that they are fatigued, and they're too fatigued to safely perform the duties. So we have to talk about what that means. And again, I mentioned this just a second ago. If the flight crew member says to the certificate holder, I am too fatigued to continue my job, right now they have to remove that flight crew member from duty. Okay, this does put the requirement on the flight crew member to think about if they are fatigued. Well, obviously the flight crew member has to make that assessment. Okay, one thing I do want to point out about this is I underlined flight duty period because a pilot could be given all kinds of other jobs to do, maybe involving simulators, maybe involving training, maybe involving any other number of things that have nothing to do with a flight duty period. And so in that case, these kinds of duty rules and time rules of how long someone can work, they don't apply. Okay, this applies specifically to flying, carrying passengers, and that means you have to plan a flight in that flight duty period for it to be a flight duty period. Okay, so, and continuing the regulation, as part of actually signing the dispatch release, the flight crew member has to say, I'm fit for duty. Okay, and what does fit for duty mean? What does fatigue mean? Well, thankfully, the FAA has given us a couple definitions here, and you can find them also in Part 117. Fit for duty means we can do the work and we are able to function at the right level that I need to do. So that means, I'm not impaired by drugs, alcohol, I'm not having a personal stressor outside that's impacting my work. So again, the crew member has to do a self-assessment with this. And fatigue, they've also defined for us. And again, you can look that up in 117. I've got the definition up here. So that's something the crew member has to say, am I fatigued or am I not fatigued? Okay, so what's a flight duty period? I already kind of alluded to this. It basically says you report for work as a crew member intending to do some flights, or at least one flight, okay? And when does it begin? This is important. It begins when you are told to report for duty. Okay, the airline's going to give you a time and say, report for duty at this time, okay? And when does it end? Well, this is key. It says here in this definition, it ends when the airplane parks after last flight and the aircraft's not going to move anymore. The crew member is not going to do anything else. We don't have any more flight. It could be another tail number. They could like walk to another gate, but we don't have anything else scheduled for that crew member to do. Notice this does not end when you get to the hotel. No, you can wander around however long you want in the terminal. You can do whatever you want, but like this, your flight duty period starts when you show up for duty at the company. The airline says show up, and it ends when the airplane stops moving. You can spend however long you want at Starbucks in the terminal being a guest, but you can't then later say, oh, I was not, I was still on flight duty period. No, that's not the definition. Okay. Now, let's talk about flight duty period a little bit more greater depth. I do want to say I am not discussing augmented operations in this video. I'm kind of trying to keep this very basic. We'll talk about augmenting, what that even is in a second. But I want to mention it because it's on this part of 117. Basically, this is our limit of the flight duty period, and part 117 contains this table, which I will put here for you to look at. You can also find this. Now, if you're using this video to study for ATP or aircraft dispatcher, there are duty time questions on those tests. That is in the figure book as figure 488 currently with the current revision for this. So do not memorize this table. That would be foolish to memorize this table. Okay, so what is this table about? This basically says for a variety of times. For example, let's say, today I actually woke up pretty early, and let's say I was told to report for work at 5:15 a.m. Okay, so if I'm scheduled to start at 5:15 a.m., then here I am, and I would fall in this line of the table. And if I were scheduled to do, say, 5 flights today, okay, here's 5 flights, and I find the intersection, and okay, that means if I showed up at 5:15 today, then I can do 11.5 hours, and the airplane needs to be stopped, and I'm done with my flying 11.5 hours after I started at 5:15 a.m. So you could calculate what that was. Okay, again, you don't have to memorize this table. I do want to go back to that word augmented, okay, because this table actually would change if we had an augmentation going on. An augmented flight crew just means some crew that the airline chooses to put more pilots, more flight crew members than the minimum that the aircraft needs. So example is on typically long type of operation, long haul, international, frequently they are going to add another crew member, and that's a relief crew member. They may come from a pilot sleeping area somewhere in the aircraft, and then they can change out, and so that allows the crew to work longer because it allows for a rest period. Again, I'm not going to get into that with this video. Also, I want to point out, this is a flight duty period table. Flight duty period does not equal flight hours. Okay, we are going to get to flight hour limits in a minute. But for my example, when I said I was going to do 5, I'm scheduled for 5 flights. I reported at 5:15 a.m., 11.5 hours of duty time, not flight time. Okay, we'll get to flight time in a second. All right, now, what happens when something crazy goes on? And things that are crazy go on all the time. In airlines, we don't always anticipate everything. There have been crazy things. So if the FAA provides for that, if there's something crazy, unforeseen operational circumstances, we'll talk in a second about what that is. If that happens before takeoff, like I haven't left yet, then the FAA says, all right, the pilot in command, that's the PIC, and the airline, we can make that flight duty period go to up to 2 hours longer. Cool. Okay. So if that were to happen with my example here, and I was at 11 and a half, okay, we can extend that up to 13 and a half. If we extend it more than 30 minutes, you can only do that once. Otherwise, that's your one shot, and then you have to have a rest period as the flight crew member. Okay, so that basically allows a little extension of the flight duty to get stuff done. Now, once again, if the crew member says, I'm too fatigued to do that, we go back to the first definition, which basically said if the crew says I'm too fatigued to do that, we stop the operation. We have to replace that crew member with someone who is fit for duty and who is not fatigued. Okay, so what is unforeseen operational circumstances? Thankfully, the FAA defined it, and here's what they said. They say, it is something basically where the airline couldn't plan for it, and we couldn't readjust the schedules, and it includes, they specify weather, malfunction of equipment, air traffic delay. So a number of years ago, there was a crazy incident in Chicago Center where a person put a bomb and blew up part of a server room running Chicago Center's ATC. That was totally unforeseen operational circumstances, had massive ripple effect, and I am sure that some people's duty days got extended because, like, that is not something the airline can anticipate. Okay, now let's also talk about that extension really quick with one more thing. You cannot extend the duty period if the crew member is then going to run into their cumulative duty period limits, which I will go over that in a second. But even if the crew agrees and they're like, oh, I'm not fatigued, I'm okay to do this, if it's going to make the crew member go over their cumulative limit, and the crew member should be keeping track of this, as should the air carrier, you can't just like continue to extend that if you're going to hit the hard limit. Okay, now that was before takeoff, extending things. What if it happens when you're flying? We're flying and an aircraft incident occurs at an airport closes, we go into holding pattern or something, and the crew is like, oh wow, we're going to hit our flight duty period limit. So my example was 11 and a half hours. We're going to hold. What's going on? Well, okay, if it's after takeoff, we're already flying, the PIC and the airline are allowed to extend the period however necessary to safely land the airplane. So we do not have to just go to the nearest suitable airport and get the airplane on the ground. That would be very inconvenient for everybody. Nobody really wants to do that. So this basically says that you can keep going, okay? But it does also say, again, if it goes over 30 minutes, that's your one shot, then you need a rest period. So what's a rest period? I'm glad you asked. So a rest period is a period determined prospectively, talk about that in a second, where the crew member is free from everything. Like, you don't have to do anything. You are not going to be called. They're not just going to leave you alone. You're off. Okay. Prospectively means we looked out in advance and said, oh, okay, your rest period is going to be starting at noon on Saturday, and I'm recording this on a Thursday, so Saturday is in the future. That's your rest. You cannot go and look backward and say, oh, hey, crew member, remember that Monday that you had off? We didn't call you up? That was your rest period. Yeah, I hope you enjoyed it because you were off then, and have a great time. So you can't like look back in time and say, oh, there was a rest period right there. No. You have to tell the crew member in advance. The crew member needs to know in advance. As a pilot, I need to know that's my rest period. Okay, during the rest period, the crew member can't take work. Okay, well, that would make sense. Yeah. Now, this is another requirement here where we start looking at this 168-hour 7-day period, which is basically saying, all right, every 168 consecutive hours, the crew member, the pilot has to have 30 hours free from duty. So it's like kind of like 1 day off every 7. Okay. But keep in mind before you're like, what? Okay, before you just don't panic with this, because don't forget, we have our duty period table but we also have a cumulative limit, which I'm going to talk about in a moment. Okay, so, but this part of 117 basically says, yeah, you get 1 day off every 7 consecutive days. Okay, now let's also talk about the beginning of a flight duty period. We talked about what the flight duty period, it's like I'm reporting for work, you've assigned me 5 flights, I'm going to do my 5 flights. Okay, before you can take that assignment, you have to have been given a rest period of at least 10 consecutive hours that starts right before it. Okay, and it has to be measured from when they were released from duty, which I remember I said a flight duty period does not end when you get to the hotel. It ends when you stop moving the airplane. Okay, so that basically says, all right, if I was supposed to report today at 5:15 a.m., I had to have the previous 10 hours, 10 consecutive hours, free from anybody bothering me. Okay, cool. And that 10-hour rest period must give me a 8-hour sleep opportunity, 8 uninterrupted hour sleep opportunity. Now, people get kind of confused with this. I hear people say lots of comments about this, and they're like, well, you know, so if I don't sleep 8 hours, now I can't fly? No, you got to read carefully with regulations. It does not say I have to have slept 8 hours. It just says I have to have been given a minimum of 8 uninterrupted hour sleep opportunity that happens during that at least 10 consecutive hours where I was free from duty. So you can see where this is going. Basically, you get like an hour on either side, supposedly, to like get from the airport to the hotel, check in, get in your room, go to sleep 8 hours, have an hour of getting ready and getting back to the airport, and then reporting again. Realistic? I don't know. Depends on where the hotel is. In Fargo, North Dakota, probably fine. New York City, if you fly into JFK and the hotel is in Times Square, yes, it's not going to work. So airlines are not ridiculous. They understand that. And so depending on what, from what they're going to do is they're going to give more like a 12-hour free period or even 14 hours and include in there, that way we get a buffer if something crazy happens, because it's on the crew member to say, yeah, I got a minimum 8 uninterrupted hours sleep opportunity. Now, I function very well on like 7 hours of sleep, so I frequently sleep 7 hours. That's totally fine. This does not dictate how long you have to sleep. Okay, now let's talk another definition. This is not even from part 117. This is 14 CFR 1.1. What is flight time? Okay, good to know. It means something that goes in my pilot logbook, and it starts when the aircraft moves under its own power to fly, not just to taxi across the airport and park it or something. Moves to fly and ends when the airplane stops. So basically it goes in the gate. Why am I talking about flight time? Well, because yes, we looked at flight duty period limitations, but remember I said this is not flight hours. So now we're going to talk about what are the flight time limitations. Okay, so what 117 says is you can't accept as a crew member an assignment or keep flying your assignment in your flight duty period if your flight time is going to exceed the limits. Again, I'm not going into an augmented flight, so this is like with the minimum number of crew. Okay, so this is another and much more simple table. This is table A in the test figure book, number 488, page 488, or figure 488 rather. Anyway, so you can look that up. So don't memorize this table, that's what I'm saying. So yeah, look it up in 117, or if you're taking the ADX or ATP test, look it up in the figure book, figure 488. Okay, what this says. So for my example that we've been going with, I'm showing up at 05:15. All right, and that would put me in this range of reporting. That means I can fly 9 hours. Okay, cool. So 9 hours, and you can kind of see this if you have to report for duty at a time where you are more likely to be on the back side of the clock or like in a window of circadian low. I mean, humans tend to get sleepy certain times of the day. They have cut down the maximum flight time. But for the most part, most report times 0500 to 1959 of the local time is 9 hours of work. I should also add, I am not unpacking another part of 117 where we have to get acclimatized if we change many, many, many time zones, because it's really beyond the scope of this video. I'm just doing a quick overview here. So look that up in 117, and maybe I should do that as a future video. Comment, I'd like to know what you think. Okay, so this is my flight time limitations. So I get 11 and a half hours of duty period, and I get 9 flight hours during that duty period. Okay, now I mentioned there is a cumulative limit, right? And you can't exceed this also, so this is very important. So looking at this, I can I can work in my flight duty period. This is not a flight time limit. This is a flight duty period. You cannot work over 60 hours in any, basically, 7 consecutive day period. 168 consecutive hours is 1 week. And then you can also not work more than 190 hours in a 28-day period, which is 672 consecutive hours. You're welcome for translating that. What this refers to is this period table here. Okay, so you can see if I have reported and I am working 11 and a half hours, well, okay, 11 and a half hours, that, that's reasonable, but let's say that I am somehow flying only one flight, as an example. If I were to go ahead and do only one flight and I'm allowed like a 14-hour duty period, that'd be cool. But basically, I can't do that for 5 days in a row, because I would actually exceed my 60-hour period in that 1 week. So again, before you freak out about there's no days off in here and only 1 in 7. Well, you're going to hit your duty period limit if you have these 14-hour duty periods and you work the whole 14-hour duty period. You would exceed your cumulative limitation. Once again, it's on the crew member and the airline to keep track of this. Okay, so also there is a flight cumulative limitation, and that is shown also in Part 117. It basically says, yeah, you can't fly more than 100 hours in a 28-day period. You can also not fly more than 1,000 hours in basically a year, unless it's a leap year, I guess. But yeah, 365. And it goes back, you're basically doing a look back 365 days to see how many hours you've flown. This is a flight time limit. Okay. What happens if we have unforeseen operational circumstances after takeoff that have going to impact our flight time? Once again, I said I was limited to 9 for my example today. What if I'm going to go over because we entered holding and I'm not really sure when we're going to get to land? Well, this thankfully gives the flight crew member the decision to go over the maximum flight time. If I were bumping up against my 9-hour limit, I can do that to the extent necessary to at least safely land the aircraft at the destination, or at the alternate if I can't get to the destination. So this allows us to just not go totally crazy on again, we don't immediately land at some nearby airport. We are allowed to go to the destination. So, thanks for watching. It was a very, very quick overview of the basics of Part 117. There is a lot more in Part 117 that can be unpacked. If you're interested in hearing me unpack that, I would love to know in the comments. I would love it if you'd subscribe, check out my YouTube channel and all the other videos that I have out there, and hope you have a great day.